This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present to your group today. I'd really like to thank ChiroHealthUSA for allowing me to have the opportunity to share some really exciting information today, especially how we can grow our practices and develop a stellar reputation within the communities that we all live and practice in. So what I'd like to do first is talk to you about how we go about adding more new patients, especially personal injury patients, to our practice. Now, as we dive into this subject, I do need to give you the proper disclaimer. I have practiced for 30 years. I've owned numerous clinics. I've been certified in the 4th, 5th, and 6th edition of the AMA guides. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. But I must also disclose to you that I am involved with a company that does sell digital x-ray software as well as hardware. And the reason I need to mention that is we're going to talk about that. And so as proper disclosure, I need to make you aware of that. And that company name is Biokinemetrics, and the software is called ChiroSight. So I'm presenting today from our corporate offices in Iowa, and we're going to be able to talk to you a little bit about what are things you can do to give yourself the reputation you're looking for from attorneys and those who make the referrals to chiropractors in the personal injury world. Now, it's not just attorneys who can actually refer patients to you. Other personal injury patients, or even your other patients who've had injuries unrelated to auto accidents, etc., may also refer their family and friends when they undergo a certain injury to you, especially as you start to establish yourself and make it known to your existing patient base that you do specialize in these kinds of injuries. But the paralegals within the attorney offices, and in many cases, the medical doctors will refer to you, especially once they see the kind of care that you provide and the documentation that you do. Now, from the attorney perspective, in their mind, they're all about getting the settlement, right? They want to get the proper compensation for their client so that they make their percentage cut of that. But for us as healthcare practitioners, it's way more than that. You know, we're not there to do a settlement. The attorney often takes a third. The care that you provide is anywhere from, who knows, a fourth to a third of the care. And the patient's usually left with something between 25 and 50% of the overall settlement. But for us, it's all about getting good outcomes, good care, helping the patient as best as we can in a timely manner so that they don't have a permanent injury. You know, after all, we're here to give them the best chiropractic care to help heal those soft tissue and alignment issues. And in many cases, it's the cervical spine. But before we dive into the details of today's subject matter, let's just establish a few ground rules. Let's take for granted that the care that you provide is the best chiropractic care in the area for your personal injury patients. Let's take for granted that the standard of care you provide, you're paying attention to the details of the injury of the patient, you're taking an excellent history, you're documenting the mechanism of injury in your records, and that the care you are providing is effective, it's modern, it's proven, it's standardized as being acceptable by the profession, and you're being ethical and giving reasonably necessary services. So if we kind of take those four components, and let's just assume that's the standard and you're living by those standards, let's shift now and kind of move into what are we talking about in terms of getting more referrals. I'm going to focus on the details inside one component to get more referrals. And that is, it's your report. And specifically, it's the radiology report. Sure, you may have your notes that provide narrative on the injury, but it's the radiology report that can be the show and tell for the evidence here. First off, it's all about ligamentous injury. So sure, you can have muscle injury. Sure, you can have some residuals. Sure, we can have other physical findings, and the patient has their subjective complaints. I get all that. But today's focus is going to be on ligamentous injuries, demonstrating that, and how do you communicate that? And this, my friends, is for sure the number one mechanism for referral. Now, are all your patients going to have ligamentous injuries who were involved in a personal injury case? Of course not. They might have a grade 1, they might have a grade 2A, they might, possibly on your uncommon cases have a grade 3. And what I'm saying to you is it's the handful of cases throughout the year where they do have the significant injury. And when the attorney sees the report on those cases, it is the total wow factor. It really demonstrates to them that you know what you're talking about. So let's dive in here. They want to know, does this patient have a rateable impairment? And the standards throughout the United States was the AMA guides to the evaluation of permanent impairment. So the 4th edition was kind of the way of the land in the 90s. And then in the first decade of the 2000s, it was the 5th edition. That was the large, thick green book. It was more than double the size of the 4th edition. And then the 6th edition, which is the most recent edition, which is accepted by the majority of the states, that's kind of the standard today. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking to you a little bit about the 5th and 6th editions. Now, all 4 editions talk about a certain way to do impairment ratings, a component of spine impairment ratings from x-rays. But specifically the 5th and 6th editions, they go into a method that demonstrates range of motion and ligamentous laxity. So on this particular case, we have to ask ourselves, would this be a rateable impairment? A picture is worth 1,000 words, and the physical findings here are pretty obvious. So when you show this to a jury or an attorney, you don't even need a report to demonstrate that this person has a finger impairment that is permanent. Pretty simple. Well, in ligamentous injuries, we're going to focus on the spine, and they can't necessarily see it. When the patient is sitting there in front of the opposing attorney trying to show that they have a permanent injury to their cervical spine, how are they going to see that ligamentous injury? And you might think, oh, it's with an MRI. And as you can see here, that this is also a pretty obvious injury here. But we all know that these are less than 1% of the injuries out there. And so you might do some biomechanical measurements. You might show a reverse curve. Those things show some kind of structural deviation from normal, but they're not necessarily a permanent injury, and they're not necessarily a ligamentous injury. So where do we go? Well, the AMA guides, it's a system to quantify the extent of an injury, and impairment ratings is one of those factors. Now, let's say you're not comfortable doing a full whole person impairment rating for all systems of the body, from internal organ to neurological systems, besides the spine impairment ratings, and you're not comfortable doing all that. I'm not going to talk to you today about all of the systems of the body. We're going to simply talk about the cervical spine radiology mechanism, specifically the AOMSI. The AOMSI analysis is just one component of impairment. However, that one component in the cervical spine could be 25% whole person impairment. In the lumbar spine, it could be 23% whole person impairment. And it's performed by doing biomechanical analysis, line mensuration on plain film or digital x-ray, the flexion extension x-rays specifically. And this is clearly defined in the AMA guides. So what is AOMSI? It's the alteration of motion segment integrity. So real simply, it's an anterior posterior shift of one vertebrae on top of the other. And if that's more than 20% of that B ratio, it's kind of the AB ratio. So on this diagram, if you look at the B measurement here, and if the A measurement, the amount of slippage or the forward movement, if that's 20% or greater, then that becomes a ratable impairment. Now, you may have some differential here that isn't 20% or isn't a certain millimeter amount. So for example, in the cervical spine, if that measurement is 3.5 millimeters, then that does define that there is definite loss of motion. In the thoracic spine, it's 2.5 millimeters, and in the lumbar spine, it's 4.5 millimeters. Again, you go back to this 20% of the AB ratio on top of that, but in generalistic terms, if there's a 3.5 millimeter shift, there is a loss of motion based on the translation mechanism. And what that means is, especially in the 5th edition, what it means is there's a 25 to 28% impairment of the whole person. In the lumbar spine, it's 20 to 23% of the whole person. And the way you determine this is with plain film or digital x-ray, static images. It's not with an MRI. It is a static flexion and extension image of the lateral view of the cervical spine. And both the 5th and 6th editions go into great detail on AOMSI for this whole person impairment. So just taking this component alone, chiropractors are spine care specialists, right? Many of the colleges state that you're a specialist of the spine, and if you're a specialist of the spine, of course you know what the spine looks like. And on an injury, especially if you're talking about possibility of residuals or even permanency, of course you're taking x-rays of the spine because you're an expert. How can you be an expert if you can't show what the spine looks like and you're going to say they have an injury to the cervical spine, right? So I highly recommend you look at the various tables, and they talk about AOMSI not just in one table, but in numerous tables of the spine impairment. And this is an example of evidence-based practice. It's published literature. It's been accepted and adopted by the majority of the states in the USA as the authoritative method for determining impairment after an injury. So it's been established in the courts. It's established in the literature by the clinicians, chiropractic, medical, etc. And one component of an evidence-based practice is that literature, and your clinical experience is a second component. And so, real simply put, evidence-based practice is healthcare with a combination of the best research, the best clinical experience, and the patient's desires. And the patient, of course, if they're injured, they want you to demonstrate that injury if they're having ongoing problems. So it's a balance of all three of the components for evidence. And certainly AOMSI actually meets those criteria. So if we want to kind of dumb it down, it's real simple. A picture does tell the story, and that X-ray with biomechanical measurement on that A-B ratio, it demonstrates it. And on this model here, there's two ways to do AOMSI. We're going to talk about them. One is called angulation, which is this one, and one is called translation. Translation was the AB method, and the angular method, when you do lines on the inferior border, as we're describing here, if there's an 11-degree differential from one level to the immediate next level, that also qualifies for a ratable impairment using the AOMSI method. So let's just talk about other biomechanical deviations of the cervical spine, such as one simple one, the reverse curve. Now, does this mean there's ligamentous laxity? Maybe, maybe not. This example demonstrated on the screen is not a ratable finding according to AOMSI. However, there are biomechanical alterations, and you certainly can use that as part of injury demonstration, possibly, depending on the other findings. Does it match up with the examination findings, range of motion, pre-existing condition, pre-injury status, et cetera, et cetera? Taking all those things into consideration, you can still use biomechanical measurements regardless if it's enough to be a ratable. And when I use the word ratable, that means it's permanent. So according to the AMA guides, if it's ratable, it means it's permanent. Again, I'm just quoting what the best research evidence is published out there. It's accepted as clinical expertise by the courts, and patients want to know what evidence suggests they might be entitled to future compensation. And there are many other research studies out there. I'm not going to dive into them here today because of time factor, but you want to become familiar with the flexion extension views and the reliability of those views as it relates to permanent impairment. So what does this all mean? Well, we do know from studies that 4 out of 5 DCs receive patient referrals after they explain X-ray findings in detail. And this is true for attorneys. So let's dive into the details now on what you need in your report to gain more referrals and establish yourself as the bona fide expert in your area when it comes to cervical spine injuries. So I had mentioned to you that there's 2 methodologies under AOMSI as defined by the AMA guides. There's a translational loss, and that was the AB ratio that I was talking about, which basically means if it's a 3.5 millimeter shift of one vertebrae on top of the other forward on flexion, and that would indicate it's ratable. Now, let's look at the graph below. So if your software used to calculate the AOMSI, you'll see here that none of the items on this graph for the C3 on top of C4, the C4 on top of C5, C5 on 6, and 6 on 7. You'll see here that none of these are ratable, but you'll notice that 4 of them do have abnormalities because they're over a 1 factor. So in this particular case, this person does not have demonstrable permanent injury according to AOMSI. They might have other permanent injuries, but according to the AOMSI method, they do not. But you still have abnormalities here. So they still have some ligamentous laxity. It's just not considered bad enough, according to the AMA guides, to be labeled as permanent by that method. So when we look a little closer, we talked about a picture being worth 1,000 words. And we have to realize who's looking at these reports, right? It's the attorney on both sides of the aisle, as well as the patient themselves and the jury, the judge making the decision. And so images such as this are valid when you see that you've got an anterolisthesis, a forward slippage of one on top of the other, what kind of potential partial tearing might be occurring, the stretching of the disc fibers compared to just a mild tear, and there is no actual anterolisthesis evident. On the other hand, we have a retrolisthesis demonstrated here on this image that causes a widening of the front side of the disc. And again, you can see how the tear is greater if there's a shift, an actual shift of the vertebrae on top of the other going back versus on the second image, a mild tear where there hasn't actually been a shift. The purpose of showing this is that these images help tell the story that you can still have a ligament injury, you just may not have the retro or anterolisthesis evident, leading to a AOMSI ratable injury. Yet they still may have scar tissue from this injury. They still may have residuals. So you can still demonstrate that problems exist. It's just not bad enough to be the AOMSI. So we've already talked about how you can do the translational methodology on flexion or extension, so the retro or the anterolisthesis. And then we talk about the angular motion, the last two lines there. The angular methodology, which is the 11 degrees on one level over the other, and that is only on the flexion radiograph according to the 6th edition. It was a little vague in the 5th and 4th editions. Could you do it on extension? So what we do in our software, we do it on both flexion extension. My advice is, depending on what your state uses, if it's the 6th edition, you're really only going to do this on flexion, and my advice is just kind of stay with that. So on the angulation method, this 11 degrees, we calculate that, and we have to look at each degree, and the way you do that is with this method here, putting a line on the inferior borders, anterior, posterior on the inferior end plate, and extrapolating those lines out to determine what the degree is and the differential of it. So I'm not going to get into, we're on a webinar of showing actual line measurements here today. This is all in the AMA guides, or it's in software that'll do it for you as well. So this is an example of doing it on flexion and how the lines extrapolate. The beauty of digital x-rays is that the software will calculate all this for you. All you have to do is plot, 4 points on the corners of the vertebrae, and the software does the rest for you. If you're using plain film, then you'll need to use, your various protractors and line drawings to do the calculation. And then this is the extension angulation. As I mentioned, 6th edition guides recommends doing it on flexion. We still do it on both just to use it, but you're not going to use extension as a ratable AOMSI. You're just going to have it there to show ligamentous issues, but not for the rating. So we all know that there's general benefits using digital x-rays, but I'm impressing upon you today using it inside your radiology report to show biomechanical alterations, and you're backing up those biomechanical alterations with the AMA guides. So you have the credibility, it bolsters your reputation, shows you know what you're doing, you're demonstrating there in fact is an injury that isn't always crystal clear on an MRI, because an MRI, while it is for soft tissue, they usually don't put the patient into a flexion or extension view. Therefore, with ligamentous injury, if you do a neutral lateral view of the cervical spine, which is what it is, and oftentimes they're laying on their back, the neck is flattened, it doesn't show any kind of anterolisthesis or retrolisthesis because it's not a motion study. So the beauty is the guides talk about taking a static flexion and extension view. And in modernizing your practice with a digital system, it allows you to gain that. Or if you do referrals out to an X-ray facility, make sure they're taking the flexion and extension view on these personal injury cases. You then can just take the software if you want to do the line drawings, because obviously general radiologists are not going to perform these kind of biomechanical measurements on the x-rays. So you would order up or take them yourself, the flexion extension views, and then you take those images, put them into your software, and then just plot the four corners, and the software will do the rest so that you can create the radiology report to show to the patient. And it's not just the AOMSI images and line graphs that you're showing the patient. You also want to show them the standard chiropractic alignment, the reverse curve, for example, perhaps disc height. Maybe you want to measure what's the height of the disc, or your technique line analysis showing why you're adjusting them a certain way, or even just showing them the findings on the x-ray images besides the biomechanical measurements, perhaps just if there was pre-existing bone spurs and how that might have caused a restriction to begin with, and now it's going to magnify those pre-existing conditions. And it helps you come up with your recommendations. After all, if they had some of these other findings, it may delay your care. It may slow down a full recovery because of these complications that you were able to demonstrate. So explaining all this inside your radiology report is important because the attorneys need to understand what is there as a result of the injury, what is there that wasn't part of it, to the best of your abilities. And these juries are going to read this report because the report's going to be admitted into evidence, and claim adjusters are going to look at it. So the construction of your report, the narrative, the language, the references are all extremely important in the report. So the professional nature of it, and some of these reports just using flexion extension views, I mean, this one here is 16 pages long, but it's explaining the story. It's showing the reader what an anterolisthesis or retrolisthesis is. It's showing them the actual digital images with the line drawings on them, and it's explaining if it's normal or not normal. You still have the ability to add your own impressions and put your own findings in there, and what that means for ongoing care or for the recovery prediction. So you're quoting, the impairment measurements, the page numbers. You're even including diagrams on how you arrived at the AB measurement, or how the software arrived at it. And you're clearly telling a story so that they understand it. The whole goal here is that nobody goes to court. The goal here is they see the report. It's crystal clear. Here's the patient's x-rays. There it is. I see it. Okay, they've got an impairment. Let's settle this thing out, because this report is your report is so well written. And that's what I'm suggesting you do. Whether you go with a software, whether you go with your own, you want to construct your report that it tells the story, and you're using the AOMSI method and your biomechanical measurements. Besides the AOMSI, you're including your other measurements that you have inside the system. So I want to talk a little bit about references. I think it's important that you validate the methodologies that you're using. You want to validate why any of your biomechanical measurements have any validity. And when you do that, and they're included in the report, I highly recommend you get the references and become familiar with the entire article. The reason you want to do that, that the sharp attorneys are going to potentially, if it is something where they're asking for six figures and they're going to go to court, you know that they're likely going to question one of these studies. They may even pull all of them. So you're going to want to have all of them. But what they're going to find is that these are well established, published in bona fide resource journals, and there really isn't anything to pick at here. These are gold standards references that you want to have. You want to make sure you don't put in some hokey reference that can be picked apart. And obviously you want to be familiar with it, but at the same time, in their determination as to whether or not they're going to settle a case, when they do review your references and realize what kind of journals they've been published in, they're going to realize that, this really isn't a case we want to take to court. Again, if the attorney's asking for $1 million or something, they're going to take it to court. And so you better be prepared to know what the references state. You want to have those articles on any reference you attach to a report. But one other reason why I like having references is because now it allows for that article or that study to be admissible in court. You use that reference to arrive at your radiology report. It was part of the foundation to establish some of the findings or conclusions of your radiology report. And trust me, the majority of times, opposing defense counsel does not want these kinds of studies admitted into court. They try to do everything they can. So if it's not listed here in the report and you show up with it in the courtroom, what often happens is a big argument occurs as not being admissible. It wasn't discussed previously. They didn't have a chance to review it. Well, by having it here in the report, and your report is admitted as part of the clinical patient record, they knew this was here. And I can tell you, the majority of cases, the vast majority, 98% of them, it doesn't go this far. They're not going to do this. It's usually a settled case because, like I said, a picture's worth 1,000 words. For example, on these three variable pages here, it helps demonstrate, and the language used in here is in standard medical textbooks. It's really irrefutable. It's used in the AMA guide, so there's really nothing to dispute. And as they start to dig into it, they start to look at the resource, the page of the AMA guides, they realize, okay, there's nothing out of bounds here. There's nothing on the fringe. It's rock solid. So I'm going to kind of do a quick little review here with you and just talk to you about how the AOMSI method inside your RAD report can really help stimulate referrals. It's visible. You understand this when you see it, combined with a little paragraph explanation and then the patient's actual image, it's there. Now, on the other hand, we talked earlier about how just a small number of your cases are actually going to have rateable AOMSI, and the majority are not going to be rateable. And that's okay. But now they get the concept, and what they're going to see is this person still has an injury. It just may not be a 25%. You are entitled to show that some ligamentous laxity is there. And depending on if you're using the 5th or 6th edition, you could still select, a 5% impairment because of soft tissue injury, stretching of the disc fibers, etc. There's a number of different things you can opt for in your clinical expertise. But what I'm saying to you is showing that this is what you're looking for and that you do have a ligamentous injury. It's not significant enough to be a permanent impairment according to AOMSI. Think about it this way, folks. The fact that your report says it's not rateable, that gives you an immense amount of credibility. You're not just saying, there's a rateable permanent injury, but what you are saying is there is still a demonstrable injury here. There is, let's say, a 2 millimeter or 2.5 millimeter anterolisthesis on here. And so they have one, it's just not bad enough to be 25%. So telling that story lets everybody know there is a problem, though. There is a clear, defined problem. And you combine that with your other biomechanical measurements from reverse curve and say, combined with all that, my opinion is this. And then you come up with your opinion. But it gives you that credibility that you know what you're talking about if it's rateable. And so it's important that we start taking flexion extension, and to save yourself, an hour of time. People often ask me, well, how much time does it actually take to create these lines on here? And this is just the angular method here, not the translational one. And so normally by just putting the 4 dots on the corners of the vertebrae, you only have to do it on the flexion and extension view. And when you do that, it will do both methods for you. It will calculate the angular method and the translational method and display both of them. And so it's possible one of the methods does not show a demonstrable rateable injury, but the other method does. So there's kind of 2 ways to skin the cat there, and I'm going to say the third way is just biomechanical issues can still show mild to moderate issues. So how do we actually get the referrals? How do we use the report? Once the attorney sees the report, even if it's not a rateable condition, they see you were looking for it. They now get what the AMA guides means. And so what I'm saying is you're demonstrating your expertise. So when they get a report, regardless if there's a permanent rateable impairment or not, this 16-page report is just going to wow the living socks off them. And it's not the volume of material, it is what's in it. And so for those of you who want to create your own in a Word doc and insert your own images, do that. You can create your own custom report, invest the time, but what I'm sharing with you today is a professional image. So many chiropractors out there type up a singular paragraph for their radiology report and a 1-sentence finding, if you will, or impression. And in doing so, there's not a lot of education that occurred there. There's not a lot of demonstration of soft tissue injury. And, it's so-so, and it often doesn't become a key component in helping the patient obtain future healthcare benefits for certain kinds of injuries that may have lingering or residual components to them to require ongoing future care. So keep it simple. And even though a big long report might not seem simple, it's the language within it and the flow of it that's important to be simple so that the layperson can understand it. You want the jury to be able to understand that report. And when you're using all these references, it gives you the credibility that you need, and especially because you're quoting the AMA guides. So in the end, it's either rateable and permanent or it isn't. And if it isn't, that's okay. You demonstrate what kind of injury is there. So if you're interested in learning more about the ChiroSight software, you can give us a call, and whether it's digital hardware that you're interested in or just the software only, or if you would like to speak to somebody, you can ask for Andrew at this number here, 888-707-7010. You can go to our website if you like. And if you would like to receive a sample radiology report, so that you can kind of maybe model your own similarly. Obviously, this is copyrighted and the images are copyrighted, so you can't use them. But if you'd like to just kind of see an example of what a detailed report looks like, that I know attorneys have oohed and awed over. I'll tell you one quick case here that we had. The attorney for one of our clients um, had referred. It was his best buddy. He told me it was his best buddy, and he had gets referrals from him every month. He said after he implemented this report, his referrals almost tripled. And so what he realized, and he called his buddy out on it, he goes, "Oh my God, you actually have this many PI cases, but you were only sending me this many." He goes, "Well, yeah, but I didn't know that you could explain it or demonstrate it this way." And so now he's referring the majority of his cases to this chiropractor. And it was his best buddy, or I guess he thought it was his best buddy. And the point I'm making here is, even though you might have good relationships with attorney referrals now, when they see this report, it truly blows their socks off, because now they don't have to sit there and try to explain this thing. The report does it for them. And they're finding that they're able to settle these cases without having to go through the great expense of going to court. So I just thought I'd share that with you and see what your thoughts are. And if you would like that, you can send Andrew an email at the above, or you can call him. And so at this point, I just wanted to mention to you that today, this week, I'm going to have to leave. I'm not going to be able to answer questions today. It is my 25th wedding anniversary, and I literally have about 5 minutes to leave to go on a trip with my wife. And so I apologize for not being able to take questions. So what I'm going to suggest that you do is submit your questions to Andrew at that email, or if you send them to ChiroHealthUSA, they'll forward them to me, and we'll respond back to you with any questions that you might have. So I wanted to say thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Christy and ChiroHealthUSA for everything, and really appreciate it. And again, if you have any questions or you want to see a sample report, go ahead and send that email to Andrew or give him a call, and we'll go ahead and take care of you. So thanks again, Christy. Thank you very much. Bye now.
I did it again. Y'all, thank goodness y'all are all popping up in here going, Christy, we can't hear you. I apologize that y'all missed the entire introduction where I was gushing about how much I absolutely love Dr. Kraus and what an amazing person he is. His heart and passion for chiropractic is just absolutely amazing. So, yes, thank you, Brenda. Y'all don't know what's wrong with me today. But anyway, I've been gushing to him and telling him happy anniversary. He was reached out to me about a week and a half ago and was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to do about the webinar because it's the 25th wedding anniversary," but they were able to schedule their plans so that he could do this webinar and then get off and then hightail it to the airport so he could go on his trip. So if you have questions, reach out to Andrew. Andrew is amazing. He's fabulous, and he has the cutest accent ever. So Andrew, I know you're listening. You remember that. And Heather's not your favorite. It's me. Right, everybody? So reach out to him. I put his email and phone number in the chat box. So y'all should be able to see that. Andrew at biokinemetrics.com. For all of those who love to download the attendance certificate, if you scroll through and look at the chat box, there is a place where you can click to download your attendance certificate. That way y'all don't have to email me. Several of you also asked, where can I get the recording? Not a problem. You're going to get an email sometime in the next hour with a link to the recording when it is available. You can also go to ChiroHealthUSA.com/webinars and click on the right hand side. It says archive webinars. You can click there at any time. Look at every webinar we have ever, well, not ever, but all the webinars we've done probably in the last 18 months are listed. You can look them up by topic, speaker. You can look them up by date. If you are looking for something in particular and you can't locate it, just email me. Y'all know my email address, Christy@ChiroHealthUSA.com. And I will let you know. Let's see. What is the name of today's speaker? Today's speaker was Dr. Stephen Kraus, and it's Kraus. Hey, Richard. Yes, I will go in there and check on my LinkedIn. Y'all are going to have to forgive me. I know I seem a little spacey today. I have been on the road 6 weeks now. Y'all know we've had to skip a couple of webinar weeks because just like y'all, I have to get my continuing education hours. And I have to get like 40 a year. And I tried to cram those in on top of all of my speaking engagements and events that I'm doing, but we are 2 weeks away from being done with that for a couple of weeks. So y'all be ready. Y'all need anything else? Richard, I'm gonna follow up with you here in just a minute. Thank you for the reminder. Y'all think of anything, because y'all know me. I always think of my questions 15, 20 minutes after a webinar, even the next day or two after a webinar. Anytime y'all have a question from today's webinar, and even those watching the recording, just email Christy@ChiroHealthUSA.com. I will forward those to Dr. Kraus and the amazing Andrew, and we will get an answer for you. So anyway, we're in it a little early. I hope you will use this time wisely to just breathe and relax and rest, because you deserve it. Y'all have an amazing rest of your day and a fabulous week, and I will see y'all next Tuesday. Bye, y'all.